would like to start by thanking Bruce Alderman for this opportunity to talk about our collective future and hopeful ways that we might approach it. And I would also like to say that the structure of my talk follows the formula: good news, bad news, good news. So I hope you can hang in there through the bad news portion, but I feel like it's necessary to include that to be really realistic and grounded in what I'm saying. But I'd like to start with a personal story that frames where I'm going. A number of years ago, I was working as the director of an ecotherapy program, and this led me to be actively engaging with and digesting news of ecological devastation on a regular basis, more than I would normally do. And it was news like this: since 1970, humanity has wiped out 60% of mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles, an annihilation of wildlife that threatens civilization itself. Or, here's another piece: since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016, we have seen the 5 hottest years on record. The vast and growing consumption of food and resources by our burgeoning global population is destroying the web of life. As you know, absorbing this kind of information as a steady diet can certainly lead to depression, despair, and apathy, as well as fear and guilt. But if we know one thing about ourselves as a species, we are not particularly inspired or motivated to action by any of these negative emotions. I believe that humanity can only be motivated by accessing pleasure, natural sources of pleasure that accord with the needs of the planet. And so this is the good news I will return to at the end. So where is our hope and our creative action to come from, given the dire predictions that we hear about us all the time? In this situation a few years ago, when I was working with the ecotherapy program, I was drowning in the bad news, and I began to have a new thought. And the thought was this: the earth is a living system for which I care deeply, and I, as a human being, am also a living system. So if I want the health and well-being of the earth as a living system, then it is appropriate to give equal regard for myself as a living system. And I found amazing hope in orienting myself in this way, according to living systems theory. So we could ask the question, what does it mean to relate to oneself as a living system? And I will return to this question in a bit. Let me first say a little bit about living systems theory, which you probably are familiar with. But first, a definition: a living system is an integrated whole whose essential properties cannot be reduced to those of its parts. The properties of the system arise from the interactions and relationships between the parts. And a systems or ecological worldview views the world as an integrated whole rather than an amalgamation of separate parts. It recognizes the fundamental interdependence of all phenomena, and humans are but one strand in the web of life. A main premise of living systems theory is that every individual component of any system influences and is influenced by every other component. Thus, change at any one point in the system eventually impacts the total system, as well as all the parts. So why turn to living systems theory as a source of hope? Let me start with a quote from Fritjof Capra, who's probably the leading expert on living systems theory at this time. And he says, "In the coming decades, the survival of humanity will literally depend on our ecological literacy, on our ability to understand the basic principles of ecology and to live accordingly. None of our global problems, energy, environmental degradation, climate change, economic inequality, violence, or war, can be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, interconnected and interdependent, and what we need is systemic solutions. The systems approach is a powerful tool that can make all the difference. This is a lesson we can learn from nature. So I take my cues from Copra's words, and let me just add a few reasons of my own, well, some borrowed from Copra, about why living systems theory is a good place to turn when we think about our future and optimal scenarios. First of all, it offers a grounded and scientific approach. It integrates scientific methodologies across diverse scientific disciplines, from the physical and biological sciences to the social sciences. And you can see the growth of systems theory in the 20th century as ever new disciplines adopted a systems approach. So in the 1920s, ecologists were studying food chains and food cycles. In the 1930s, biologists developed general systems theory. In the 50s, cybernetics emerged, and systems thinking had a strong influence on engineering and management and solving practical problems. In the 60s and 70s came the formulation of complexity theory and nonlinear dynamics with the development of computers. And in the 80s and 90s, a proper mathematical language for living systems emerged. And of course, throughout the 20th century, the new physics was also giving us a different vision of nature and the building blocks, really overturning the Newtonian worldview and offering instead a complex web of relationships between various parts of a unified whole as the basic nature of the universe. We also learned from quantum theory that subatomic particles are not isolated grains of matter, but probability patterns, interconnections in an inseparable web of life that includes the human observer and his or her consciousness. Thus, from all these different disciplines, we can see that systems theory forms a coherent theoretical framework that describes the principles of organization of all systems across the universe and the operations of the universe as a whole. It's a really powerful tool for understanding our world and our place in it. And Copra says it's a unifying theory that can provide a universal approach to all the sciences. It also entails a fundamental shift in our view of the world, basically a shift from a mechanistic conception to a holistic conception, a change from seeing the world through the metaphor of a machine to seeing life and the world as a network, and a search for the patterns and forms and relationships that underlie order and organization. And finally, another reason for looking to living systems theory is that it offers a reliable and trustworthy correction for our human transgressions of the web of life, of the law of life. So now this is the bad news portion of my talk, which concerns the human transgression of the law of life. And I want to go into this a little bit just to highlight what we're facing as we think about the future. So as you know, many scientists believe the world today is entering a sixth mass extinction, the first one to be caused by a single species, Homo sapiens. Some analyses suggest that humankind has destroyed 83% of all mammals and half of all plants since the dawn of civilization. And that even if the destruction were to end now, it would take 5 to 7 million years for the natural world to recover. So mass extinction is probably not new news to you, but what may be new to you, as it was to me, is how long it's been going on. So now I want to delve into a little bit of a history lesson, just to again get the big picture. So perhaps, like me, you believe that the human destruction of the environment began just 12,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution. Or maybe you thought that it began more recently, just a couple hundred years ago, with the Industrial Revolution. But according to Yuval Noah Harari, The first wave of extinction actually began 70,000 years ago with the spread of hunter-gatherers from the Afro-Asian landmass across the planet. It was then followed by the second wave of extinction, the agricultural revolution that accompanied the spread of farmers, and the third wave of extinction with the spread of industrial activity. So long before the Industrial Revolution, Homo sapiens held the record among all organisms for driving the most plant and animal species to their extinction. We have the dubious distinction of being the deadliest species in the annals of biology. The knowledge that our destruction of the web of life began not 12,000 years ago, but 70,000 years ago, caused me to rethink and reassess who we are as a species. Our destruction of the planet has been with us a long time and constitutes arguably the shadow of our species. The first wave of extinction began with what Harari calls the cognitive revolution. And that part of the story is probably most familiar and most celebrated. This is like who we like to think we are, is the clever species with the big brain. So about 70,000 years ago, humans invented boats, oil lamps, bows and arrows, needles, art, religion, commerce, and social stratification. And all of these inventions were a product of a revolution in Homo sapiens' cognitive abilities. There were genetic mutations that changed the inner wiring of the sapiens' brain, enabling us to think in unprecedented ways and to communicate using an altogether new type of language. And then this new sapiens language eventually enabled us to conquer the world. So Harari identifies three new cognitive abilities that we acquired in this period from about 30,000 BC to 70,000 BC. One is the ability to transmit larger quantities of information about the surrounding natural world. The second is the ability to transmit larger quantities of information about sapiens' social relationships. And the third is the ability to transmit information about reality that is not physically in existence. In other words, the ability to imagine. And this entailed the creation of social constructs or imagined realities, including mythology. And mythology became the glue that could bind together a large number of human individuals, allowing for unprecedented social cooperation. So thanks to our ability to invent fiction, sapiens created more and more complex social structures, further elaborated by each new generation. Social structures actually and technology. So 70,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers began completely reshaping the ecology of our planet. Prior to 70,000 years ago, all species lived on the Afro-Asian landmass. But following the cognitive revolution, we acquired the technology, skills, and vision to break out of Afro-Asia and settle the outer world. And the first of these remote places to be settled was Australia. That was about 45,000 years ago. Up until then, our effect on our environment had been negligible. But the settlers of Australia transformed the Australian ecosystem beyond recognition. Within a few thousand years, 23 out of 24 Australian large animal species became extinct, along with a number of other smaller species. Food chains were broken and entirely rearranged by our presence. And wherever people settled in another part of the outer world, it was followed by large-scale ecological disaster, leaving behind a long trail of victims, and the first to go were the large mammals. This now familiar tragedy has three scenes. It opens with a scene showing a rich and varied population of large animals without any trace of humans. In scene 2, sapiens appear, evidenced by a human bone, a spear, point, or ceramic pots. And in scene 3, men and women occupy center stage, and most large animals, along with many smaller ones, are gone. The historical record makes Homo sapiens look like an ecological serial killer. The destructive nature of our species is such that everywhere humans went, the large mammals were wiped out in a very short period of time. And I belabor this point because I believe if we are going to build an honest and grounded hope for the future, we absolutely must first come to terms with the shadow side of our species, our deeply destructive nature that has been going on not for 12,000 years or a few hundred years, but for 70,000 years. If we're going to reverse our course, we must first attend to this shadow. When our man-made habits, lifeways, and institutions become dysfunctional, fall into disarray, break down, or collapse, as we're seeing today with so many of our systems, one place we can always turn is toward the primordial living systems designed by nature in order to understand how life functions and thrives at a basic elemental level. We can use the living systems of nature as our guide back to an alignment with life itself. So let me mention just a couple of basic principles of living systems theory that I think will be most useful to us in this endeavor. First is the concept of equilibrium, and according to Thomas Kuhn, all systems tend toward equilibrium, and a prerequisite for the continuance of a system is its ability to maintain a steady state or a steady oscillating state. Secondly is the notion of feedback loops. Feedback occurs when the outputs of a system are routed back into the system as inputs in a chain of cause and effect that forms a circuit or a loop. The system can then be said to feed back into itself. And this concept is really the foundation of systems thinking. Systems contain just two types of feedback loops: positive or reinforcing feedback loops, and negative or correcting or balancing feedback loops. And feedback loops control the behavior of a system over time. So positive or reinforcing loops cause either runaway exponential growth or exponential decline. They drive a system further from its initial baseline. For example, the world's population started growing exponentially after the Industrial Revolution and the birth of modern technology, because these allowed for an expansion of life. But obviously we're seeing the consequences of this exponential growth. By contrast, balancing or negative feedback loops cause a system to maintain its present state. And then two other further concepts: closed systems and open systems. So closed systems are one where the interactions occur only internally among the system components, but not with the environment. And open systems, by contrast, accept input from their environment and use this input to create output, and then they act on the environment. Open systems are adaptive because they can learn, and based on that learning, they can adapt to changes in their environment in order to survive or maybe even thrive. Also, open systems tend toward higher levels of organization, while closed systems only maintain or decrease in organization. So lastly, I just want to say, if you happen to read the Wikipedia article on living systems theory, it offers at the very end of the article one very brief critique. It critiques living system theory for, quote, omitting the analysis of subjective phenomena. And this is exactly what I would like to address, because I believe this is where some original thinking and hopeful scenarios can emerge. So by applying living systems theory to oneself and one's own subjective processes, the very part of living systems theory that hasn't been attended to, I believe we can find some new sources of hope for a positive future. So again, I return to the question I asked at the beginning: what does it mean to relate to myself as a living system? It means to consciously, actively, intentionally, openly, and willingly participate in feedback loops. The intentional cultivation of feedback loops creates a communication-rich dynamic, an open system that receives information and adjusts accordingly. So I want to talk about some internal feedback loops that humanity could attend to that would refine our living systems and our relationship with the living system of the planet. These are first three built-in internal feedback loops. And the first one I'll mention, I'm sure there are others, but these are the three that I wanted to highlight today. The first one is affect regulation. So our emotions are a gift bestowed on us by evolution. And affect regulation refers to the ability to modulate one's emotional state in order to adaptively meet the demands of the environment. High affect regulation means an ability to flexibly adapt to a range of stressful situations. It is related to the quality of executive and cognitive functioning. And mindfulness meditation is certainly a helpful tool in improving affect regulation, becoming a neutral observer of our subjective states. This enables us to redirect our emotions in creative ways. And I think affect regulation involves several subset of skills. First, learning to identify our varying emotional states. Second, allowing our emotions to inform us. For example, fear informs us of a perceived danger. Anger informs us of a perceived injustice. Grief informs us of loss. Shame informs us of breaches of personal integrity. And then thirdly, in addition to learning to identify our emotional states and being informed by them, we can learn to channel the affective energy behind our emotions in appropriate and even creative ways in order to respond in socially effective manners. So that's affect regulation. That's one feedback loop, internal feedback loop that we can cultivate. The second one is dreams. Mammals have been dreaming for 80 million years. Again, this is a gift of evolution, a feedback loop set up by evolutionary processes. According to Carl Jung and the depth psychologists, dreams are a feedback loop between the conscious and unconscious sides of the psyche. And Jung actually describes the function of dreams in terms of living systems. He says the psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium through dreams. The primary function of dreaming is psychological compensation. Dreams help maintain a healthy dynamic balance between conscious and unconscious sides of the psyche. And when the waking ego becomes too one-sided or represses part of the unconscious, then dreams emerge to highlight the imbalance and guide the individual back toward balance, wholeness, and integration. So when we have a dream, we can ask the question, what conscious attitude does this dream compensate? And Jung found that many dreams offer correctives to the excesses of the waking ego. For example, if we become inflated, our dreams will bring us humbling self-portraits. If we're too impressed with our own goodness and moral righteousness, our dreams might show us our failings and our darker impulses. So by becoming willing to listen to the dream and learning the symbolic language of the dream, we can participate in this feedback loop. And then the third feedback loop I'll mention is the body. The body is full of luminous signals and meaningful information waiting to be apprehended and unfolded by the possessor of the body. Arnold Mindell talks about this in terms of channels, the body feeling states, visual imagery, auditory sounds when we hear a voice speak to us, tell us something, and also through movement. So all of these are internal channels and signals that are part of a feedback loop. And our body is really an integral and essential part of our being as the conduit of our experiences, but many people ignore it and even intentionally numb their physical sensations, leaving the mind-body connection undeveloped. So this feedback loop of signals that we receive from our body about itself and about the environment enables us to refine and enhance our motor control and our responses to life. And this can lead to a sense of enjoyable harmony and consciousness, the mind-body connection. We also need our bodies in order to sensitize us to the delicate balance of life. By paying attention to the signals from our body, we learn about what creates health in a body, and we can use this knowledge to understand what creates health in other bodies, including the body of the earth. Our bodies are really a refined, trustworthy consultant, our most intimate consultant on the delicate balance of life. Our symptoms, our subtle signals like tension, nausea, constriction, are a feedback loop indicating that something is starting to go out of balance. And we can pay attention to that rather than letting the symptoms grow and escalate. And our most refined feedback loop is really the energy body. This entails paying attention to blockages, openings, and flows in the inner body or the subtle body. And by developing our capacity for micro-attention, we can attend to the energy body. Then I want to mention an external feedback loop. So if we begin to treat the world as a communicative partner, rather than an other, rather than something separate, but as a living communicative partner, we can use the natural and man-made environment to seek information and participate in the feedback loop with our world. And again, Arnold Mendel says the world is a channel of information and a source of wisdom. The Native American worldview also recognizes this, experiencing the earth and the environment as a wise guru that sends messages through the rivers, the stones, the stars, even social conflicts and discord in relationships and incongruities. These are all signals or messages from the phenomena of the world. And the world as a feedback loop can also give me signals when I'm out of balance, when I'm clashing with the world. I can notice clash points and notice openings. So the discipline of attending to internal and external feedback loops leads to a high degree of self-possession. Only as I possess myself am I freed from the need to possess things, others, and the earth. Finally, I want to talk, I'm coming to my last good news points. I want to talk about the pleasurable future of humanity and finding the harmonies in flow with life. So the good news is that the harmonization of internal feedback loops and external feedback loops allows us to participate in flow states, and that our bodies contain a natural built-in self-gratification system, which is flow states. So flow states were first introduced by Csikszentmihalyi, and he defines flow states as the holistic experience that people feel when they act with total involvement. Flow states arise when we're totally absorbed and focused on the task at hand and feeling confident in our ability to approach it. And some other features of flow states are the following. A sense of ease persists. People typically feel like they're performing at the best of their ability with effortlessness. They're extremely enjoyable and gratifying. They produce an optimal state of intrinsic motivation and reward as opposed to being externally motivated or rewarded. They can bring us to a state of optimal performance. They can be applicable to anyone in any situation. Concentration in flow states is so intense that there's no attention left over to think about anything irrelevant or to worry about problems. Self-consciousness disappears and the sense of time is often distorted. And people will even risk their lives in an attempt to experience the euphoric feeling that flow states produce. So two other terms for flow states, athletes often refer to it as being in the zone. And in the religious literature, states of ecstasy are an altered state of consciousness that are comparable to what is spoken of as flow states. So consciousness plays a key role in facilitating these states. Consciousness functions as a clearinghouse for sensations, perceptions, feelings, and ideas, establishing priorities among the diverse information. And as conscious beings, we can direct conscious events such as thoughts, sensations, and intentions, giving us the power to organize our consciousness in ways that are conducive to flow. So the optimal state of inner experience is one in which there is order in consciousness. Now, in addition to flow states that are achieved through high-level performance activity, externally directed activities, which is what I've been talking about, there is a lesser-known type of flow state, of what I'm calling an internal flow state. This is the internal flow of the energies through the body, which is also a pleasurable and optimal state, and is possible when there's a high level of coherence and harmonization within oneself. In this internal flow state, conscious awareness can flow through our body's nervous system, behavior, and actions. And the natural body taps into these channels of deep flow within that confer a subtle yet tangible pleasure in simply being alive. The emergence of internal flow states indicates that the mind-body as a living system is in a high degree of internal and external harmonization. And this is where attending to these and cultivating these feedback loops that are an intrinsic and pleasurable way of being, as opposed to a defensive or survival mode of being. So the living system of ourselves is operating at its highest level of refinement when we find this inner alignment that is also in alignment with life, with the processes of life. And I wonder, how might human relations, human structures and institutions be different if everyone possessed a capacity for this kind of self-harmonization and access to the built-in pleasure of internal flow through a deep cultivation of feedback loops and participation in feedback loops? What kind of pressures would this take off the human impulse to remake the world according to our desires, which is also a destroying of our world? Attuning to our own living system is a way of listening to the delicate balance of life, of retraining our consciousness toward an attunement to all living systems. We practice first with ourselves. And I conclude with a quote from Confucius. He said, "To put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must cultivate our personal life. And to cultivate our personal life, we must first set our hearts right." Thank you.